Delawensis Steve Newcomb, Nulalendam Elipauk. Gishilamiang, Kikayu Yamananingake, Mil Ongundawakan, Wuli, Nepali, Wuli Nipalinen, Wanishi, Gishilamiang, Kikayu Yamananingake. That's a brief prayer in our Lenape language. I'm Shawnee in Lenape, and the prayer is basically asking for good blessings for everyone and to stand us up straight and tall and true as we walk on the sacred path through life. Lehe lehe okan. I'm very honored to be here with you for this Anishinaabe Law Conference, and I thank Joe Lagarde for inviting me, and thanks to all the organizers, to Amy and Joe and whoever else contributed to putting this together. I'm going to do something that I haven't done before in this presentation, and just a little bit of background on myself. My grandfather, Bushyhead Spybuck Newcomb, and his father, Solomon Newcomb, both ended up at Haskell boarding school in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And, you know, our family was not, we ended up, my native grandparents, my Shawnee, Grandma Bessie Edmonds, and my Grandpa Bush, ended up moving out to the Pacific Northwest. And that's where I was born, in Portland, Oregon. And so it's been very interesting to be able to learn from traditional elders and spiritual people, ceremonial people over the course of my life. I sought out those people, and I very much identified with the stories that Stephanie was mentioning yesterday in her life, because we're about exactly the same age. And I grew up part of my life in the San Fernando Valley, and was part of that, hanging around the activists and ceremonial people when I was a teenager and seeking out some sense of identity and purpose, because I was quite lost. And I was very fortunate to be able to go into ceremony when I was quite young, starting at the age of 16, with very extraordinary spiritual people, ceremonial carriers. And my father, my non-native dad, taught me to read by the time I was 4. And my Grandma Bessie told me a story one time when later I went to visit her for some time, stayed with her and my grandpa in Portland, and she related a story. She used to be my daycare. And so one time she came out of the kitchen, and I was sitting in the living room with my cousin in front of me, and I had a book in front of us, and I was reading to him from this book. And she thought that was peculiar for a 4-year-old to be reading to his cousin. Anyway, so she asked for the book, and she pointed to the various words, and I could read every word. So I simply relate that story because I've always been very fond of reading and been an avid reader. And it set me in the right direction as far as this work that I've been doing. So the combination of ceremonial connection and scholarship and so forth was very critical to my path, my life path. And my idea was to go into federal Indian law, to become a lawyer and become an advocate for the people and all that. So I ended up taking rhetoric and communication, persuasion as rhetoric, and at the University of Oregon, and eventually took a federal Indian law course from Charles Wilkinson as an undergraduate student. They gave us special permission as undergraduates to be able to take that law class. And when we came to reading Johnson versus McIntosh, and I remember reading that decision and thinking how bizarre it was and how angry it made me. But it made me think of the book God Is Red, because in that book, Vine Deloria Jr. mentions the Vatican papal bull. He has one of the papal bulls from May of 1493, and he has a sentence in there quoted from William Washburn's Red Man's Land, White Man's Law. And so I put those two together, and I said there must be a connection between this Supreme Court ruling and that quote in Deloria's book. So I tried asking about that in class, and of course there was no time to spend on anything so esoteric as that. But then eventually what I understood was, in rhetoric, you're learning about debate and persuasion, this sort of thing. And if you're so foolish as to accept the premise of your opponent, it's a foregone conclusion that you're going to lose. And I realized that Johnson versus McIntosh ruling was the premise of the system that we're up against. And I said, why in the hell would I stick my head through that news? So I'm not an attorney, actually. That's a mistaken idea. But I'm intentionally not an attorney. Nothing against attorneys. They do their thing, they do their work, and so forth. And a lot of it's very excellent and very, very necessary within an overall system that I'll describe to you. But in any case, for various reasons, I stepped away from academic life, went my own way, and became a self-taught person, an autodidact, I guess is the technical term for it. And the thing that I'm going to do today that I haven't done before is list off some of the areas that I've actually dived very deep into. I mean, I'll be 70 next year, so I've been at this for a few decades. And so in addition to the rhetoric and communication, I've also investigated philosophy and poetics, etymology, sociology, U.S. law, federal Indian law, or what we call federal anti-Indian law, international law, political science, theology, cognitive theory, or the theory of the human mind and metaphorical systems, history, moral and ethical systems, and the Vatican papal bulls of the 15th century, which I've been studying in Latin and English since 1989. The reason I haven't mentioned this previously in any talks is because, you know, it's pretty hard to list off all that without sounding like a complete egomaniac. But, you know, I say this only to give you some sense of how seriously I take this work and how diligently I've really dived into all these various areas of knowledge. I was so fortunate to meet my friend and mentor in, I believe it was March of 1992, Virgil Killstraight, a traditional headman of the Oglala Lakota Nation, who passed to the spirit world on February 10th of 2019. And Virgil and I worked together for more than 25 years on an effort to call upon the Pope at that time, Pope John Paul II, and the Vatican to formally revoke the Inter Cetera Papal Bull of May 4th, 1493, and the patterns of domination that were unleashed on the planet, not just by that document, but by many of those documents. And you know, you can list off all the dates in 1436 and 1452, 54, 55, 56, 1481, 4 in 1493, 1 in 1506, and 1 in 1514. And when you read through all of those that you might have an occasion to look at, you know, not only are your eyes going to glaze over looking at the Latin and trying to sort that out, but just trying to find the needle in the haystack to make sense of what really is in those documents and how that relates to and becomes the foundation and cornerstone for what is now called federal Indian law, or what my friend Peter Dorico, in his brilliant book titled Federal Anti-Indian Law, calls that. So it is very much an anti-Indian system of ideas and arguments, artistically put together by extremely bright intellectuals from Western Europe, what was called Western Christendom, and unleashed on our nations and peoples, and still used to this day, and the claim of a right of domination that is inherent within and embedded within those documents, and documents such as the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling. Key case in point is the sentence that Chief Justice John Marshall writes in the Johnson ruling when he says the character and religion of its inhabitants, meaning the continent's inhabitants, afforded an apology, meaning created a justification for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. And you go and look up the word ascendancy, and it means governing, influence, and domination. So the thing is that the word domination is actually in that word ascendancy. So then you can re-express that sentence. The character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim a right of domination. And that's completely accurate. And that's just one example. The use of ultimate dominion and the way in which dominion relates to the Latin dominium. And the root of Latin dominium is domo, which means to subjugate, to subdue, to force into subservience, to tame, to domesticate, to cultivate, and to till. And to cultivate in Latin is colere, which means to colonize and to design. And we take that word colon and you break it apart, or the word colonization, you get colon, which is the digestive tract of the predator body politic. And the word colo in Latin means to filter out impurities in the process of mining. So mining is the backdrop for all of it. Mine everything that you possibly can in order to make profit. And one of the things that's important, because we are communicating in this colonizer's language called English, more than 60% of this language is derived from the Latin language of the Roman Empire. And which is, of course, a language of domination, one of the most formidable and brutal empires to ever exist on the planet. And so the way in which all of this has influence on what we do as advocates for our nations and peoples, one of the things, I was at a conference one time and I said, don't think for a moment that just because that we're all speaking the same language because we're all speaking English, because we have different orientations. We come from different cultural backgrounds and mental worlds and so forth. So an Anishinaabe law conference really is about Anishinaabe, the mental world of the Anishinaabe people. And what is that mental world? And why was it that the United States government took our relatives and our ancestors and some of us that are even existing, living today, and putting them in these so-called boarding schools, which were indoctrination centers designed to commit genocide against our nations and peoples. And of course, genocide is the intention to destroy in whole or in part an entire nation or people. And that's exactly what was going on there. There was a congressional hearing in 1929 on the brutality and the sadism and abuse that was going on in the boarding schools of domination in the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century. And there's an amazing book called Massacre by Robert Gesner. He published that book when he was only 24 years old. He should get a medal. We should all, have an event where we praise this man and honor him for his amazing accomplishment at the age of 24 to be able to go all over Indian country and do interviews and recount so many horrific things that were happening at that time. And not many people know about the book. And I found it at a used bookstore called Miles of Books. And anyhow, it's extraordinary. But the kinds of horrific treatment of the children in those schools, and we all know about that. But the graphic description that he's giving, and how we have to painfully work through all those layers of trauma and all that kind of wreckage that's left in the aftermath of all those patterns of domination. As I said, with regard to the Anishinaabe people and the mental world and spiritual world, cultural world of the Anishinaabe as just one of the original nations and peoples of this Turtle Island continent, the idea of Anishinaabe law is really, of course, going back to the context for this event. And that context, which I would describe as the beginning with the original free and independent existence of our nations and peoples, extending back to the beginning of time through our oral histories and oral traditions, contrasted with the system of domination that was brought by ship across the ocean and imposed on everyone and everything. And once we have that starting point of that context, then we have the view from the shore of our ancestors looking out at those ships sailing toward them. And we have the view from the ship of the colonizers with their documents and the intention of domination sailing toward our ancestors. And what do we do about that today in terms of how do we actually engage that system that I'm talking about? And do so in this colonizer's language. One of the things that I was thinking about a while back is that Rosetta Stone that they found, and the whole idea of decoding. How do you decode something, and what is a code? It's a secret language of symbols and signs and so forth to be able to orchestrate meaning and also to create reality. Words create and shape reality. And I was at the United Nations in 1996. I was a political advisor to Milo Yellowhair when he was vice president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. We ended up at the intercessional working group on the draft UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I took an opportunity to ask the U.S. delegation a question. And I said, if one day, supposing one day, the draft UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is fully adopted by the UN, perhaps even becoming a convention of the UN system, of what actual practical significance will that be to indigenous nations and peoples throughout the world? And this one man in the back who never said anything, he was a political advisor for the State Department. He suddenly spoke up and he said, well, to the extent that words have meaning, and to the extent that meanings configure reality, the draft declaration has importance. That's the level on which those folks are always operating. And they know with tremendous precision exactly how they're going to use language, where they're going to put an apostrophe, whether they're going to put an S on people and make it peoples. What is all the significance of that? What's the difference between people, which is individual, and individuals, and peoples, which is an entire people, and another entire people, and another entire people. And when you put all that whole group of all those peoples together, then you have peoples in English. So then you want to put an apostrophe after the S in order to indicate that. But if you put it before the S and you make that mistake, now you are only referring to individuals and not entire peoples, which are also nations. So this is the kind of precision that those State Department folks and lawyerly types within those political and legal circles operate. And so we are at quite a disadvantage for those of us that are not fully aware of that. And the thing is that I believe we have to come up with very unique approaches. We ought to, let me put it that way. People can do whatever they want, but it would be a good idea, in my opinion, to lay out exactly what the system of domination is and identify it very explicitly and very clearly. Because my friend Joe De Gaudi, who was the chairman at the Yakama Nation for quite a number of years, and he studied all this kind of information. He became a tremendous student of the very gifted and brilliant student of this framework. And he took that into meetings with federal and state officials, county officials, and so forth. And oftentimes he would go into those meetings and say, I think it's important to deal with historical truth with integrity. And then when he said that word integrity, heads would begin to nod because everybody thinks integrity is great. And then he would bring into the mix the doctrine of domination and the papal bulls and so forth, because the vast majority of all the politicians and all the lawyers and everyone is completely oblivious to the existence of those documents and their influence on federal Indian law and policy. And so I think that we have to be cautious to not apply our enemies' arguments to ourselves. And enemies is a strong word. It's a word that doesn't sound respectful. It doesn't sound like we want to have beneficial relations. But I'm talking about the historical record of enmity toward our nations and peoples, people that attempt to destroy your very existence. It's pretty tough to have respectful relations with people that have that as their cultural and historical legacy and the benefit from all of that every single day and never look back on it in any kind of self-critical manner. And I congratulate all of the non-native people and thank all the non-native people who do work tirelessly as allies and are tremendous support people. And I think they deserve tremendous praise for that, and Wanishi to you for that. So one of the arguments that I have started with is first in time, first in right. It was mentioned yesterday with regard to water rights. It's kind of funny that it works with water rights, but it doesn't work with regard to those ships getting over here to begin with. And then I asked in the recent paper that I'm working on, how much land did they manage to bring over on those ships? As I recall, they arrived landless. So then how is it that they turn around when all they did was step off that ship with a claim to something, but then they turn around and somehow we're the ones with the claim? How does that work? And then we buy into that. And that's peculiar to me. And it means that we're not dealing with language and information and knowledge systems with precision, because we're not keeping careful track of all of the steps within the overall process of thought that are accurate. And so when they arrived here, we know what they engaged in, which were symbolic acts, ceremonial, metaphorical acts, the use of metaphor and symbolism to create reality, very consciously, very consciously. And remember, these are very brilliant people that do these things. They're very nefarious, but they're very bright. And so there's a book, amazing book from the 1930s called Creation of Rights of Sovereignty Through Symbolic Acts, written by 3 students of international law at Columbia University, studying under 2 of the most eminent international law scholars in the world. And one of them was Charles Cheney Hyde, and I don't recall the other gentleman's name, but the Charles Cheney Hyde was at the State Department for a time. And anyway, this book goes through all of the various countries that use these symbolic acts to quote unquote create rights of sovereignty. Well, what are rights of sovereignty? I mentioned that yesterday, which is Jean Baudin in 1576 coined that term, and he defined it as supremacy, which is just domination. Domination over citizens or subjects unrestrained by the laws. So the sovereign issues the laws and expects everyone to be subject to those laws in a pattern of domination and subordination, but is subject to no law and no restraints whatsoever. And so that's the idea, that they can simply come on shore and conduct some kind of ceremonial acts, pile up some stones or plant a flag, have a notary public there and make some pronouncements, sing a song, wave a sword, do whatever the heck they're going to do. And suddenly they, voila, abracadabra, they have possession of the land. So they got 40 guys that get off the ship or the boat, the little boat that comes from the ship. And so they're holding all that land all the way from the mouth of that river all the way to the source with their little bitty hands. That's ridiculous. So we know that these are all metaphors, which are acts of consciousness that border on the very creation of things, as Roger Jones mentions in his book, Physics as Metaphor, which is an amazing book, and I highly recommend that. So the way in which our minds get conditioned to experience reality in certain ways because of the metaphors that we get hooked into and habitualized to, that is what we need to be paying attention to. So I'm long-windedly going to a first principle that I want to express, which is first in time, first in right. Not first off the ship in time, first off the ship in right, but the first nation in time, the first people in time, the first nation or people in right. And the second principle is void when initiated. You cannot grant what you don't possess. If you want to get fancy with it, you can express it in Latin as void ab initio nemo date quod non abit, which just means the same thing in Latin. And what that means is that those documents that were issued by popes and monarchs in Christendom, as they called it back then, were null and void when they issued them, because they had no rightful jurisdiction across an ocean. And they were certainly null and void when they arrived to the territorial waters of any coastal nation. And so these are important things to consider. And the last third principle is anything that's wrong from the beginning can never be made right because it was wrong from its inception. And that was designed by Glenn Wasson of the Western Shoshone Nation, an elder from there. And when you combine those three principles together, that's a checkmate framework for the dominators that come over claiming a right of domination, which actually doesn't even exist. They can claim it all they want, but they'll never have it, not validly and not rightfully. And that's why they have to back it up with lethal force. They see these are the pronouncements that we're making in these legal decisions. And remember that we're backing this with legal force. So what is the definition of law in that context? The habit of obedience. That's one of the definitions of law. Law also goes to the word lex in Latin, which means to bind. In Lakota, there's a wonderful term, gashke. Gashke means to be released. If your hands are tied and then you're suddenly released, that's gashke. And so this is what we need to be working on, the mental gashke of our nations and peoples, each and every one of us, to become freed and liberated from these metaphorical systems that have conditioned us to simply live in obedience to the claim of a right of domination, which doesn't even exist to begin with. Well, it exists in the sense that they claim it and make everybody believe in it. It is interesting when you look at words such as, lega, L-E-G-A, and that's a word in Latin meaning to bind. So you have allegiance and legacy. The legacy of the doctrine of discovery was listed as the talk. I would call it the legacy of the doctrine of domination and the claim of right of domination. But it's also in the word allegiance. And when we break apart different words in English, we get at a whole different understanding. For example, the word America is two Latin words put together. Ame, which means it's a command meaning love, and rica, which is riches and wealth. Love, riches, and wealth. So the American dream is the dream of riches and wealth through the use of the claim of a right of domination to grab a hold of resources and everything that can be turned into riches and wealth. It's very interesting that there's a sentence in the Vatican Papal Bull from May 4th, 1493, that expressed in English reads, "We trust in him," confidentes in Latin for trust, but we have confidence in him, capital H on him, which is referring to their deity, from whom, meaning out of whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed. And so when you think about that for a minute, my goodness, that's quite extraordinary that empires and dominations are emerging out of their concept of a deity. And I had the good occasion to, interesting occasion to interact with one of the Vatican ambassadors at the United Nations some years ago. And I just saw that he had a collar on. I didn't know what position he held at the UN, but he was a nuncio there for the Vatican. And I simply asked him if he was with the Holy See, and he said, yes, he was. And I said, well, you probably know Latin. What does Dominorum Christianorum mean? And he said, well, probably Lord's, probably Master, probably Mister. Yes, Mister. And I said, oh, okay. So in other words, land's not possessed by any Mr. Christian? And he said, well, it's best not to trans English because it would not fit. So then we parted company and then ended our conversation. I went inside where the permanent forum was happening and just stood inside the door. I was talking to this guy to my left and watching the room, and I saw him go toward their chair. Next thing I knew, he was in front of me, and he took me by the arm and pulled me out of the room and to the hall, which was very quiet. And he said, you know, that term you're talking about, I believe that's referring to Jesus Christ or God. And I said, oh, well, then I have another question for you. There's another sentence in the document, never said what the document was, but there's another sentence in the document that says, we trust in him. And at that point, he said, that's Jesus Christ or God. You should never do that, by the way. Don't interject something if you don't know the outcome of the sentence before you've interjected. And so I continued. I said, him from whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed. So if the empires and dominations are coming out of him, who is Jesus Christ or God by his own admission, does that mean it's a God of domination? And he never paused for 1 second. And he said, well, everything comes from God, the birds and the trees. And what was your name again? And so I've been interacting with a lot of those Vatican people for quite some time and informing them of their theology of domination that has gone all across the planet and been used as an organizing principle for the planet. So when you have domination as the organizing principle of the planet in all aspects of life, then you end up with the wreckage and consequence and destructive outcome of all those patterns of domination. And yet nobody seems to understand that we ought to be calling it by that name. One of the things that's important to think about is how can we strategically and tactically use our own metaphorical ways of framing things in order to push back against all that and to construct our own sense of reality in keeping with our traditional teachings and instructions. As far as I'm concerned, our original instructions can be distilled down in one concise statement. Live in a manner that's beneficial to ourselves, to one another, and to all living things. And when we understand that, if that were made into the organizing principle of the planet, instead of all these claims of domination and so forth, we would have a completely different type of planet at this time, because we wouldn't be dealing with all the trauma and wreckage from domination. So one of the ways that I thought of to use language very interestingly, creatively, would be to attach, referring to the so-called sovereigns that came across the ocean. They like to claim that they're sovereign, or that they were sovereigns that came across the ocean with their representatives. And so I think we should attach the word immigrant to that word sovereign. They're the immigrant sovereigns who came over to places that were already existing with their own philosophical and spiritual and ceremonial and mental systems that had worked out wonderful ways of interacting with the natural world to sustain life, to maintain life forever, permanently. And that's what the traditional teachings and the ceremonial ways are all about, is to make sure that that happens. So, you know, my friend Joe DeGatti was going to a meeting with the federal officials regarding environment. And I said, well, I have a question you can ask them. And he said, well, what's that? And I said, name me one place that's better off today than before you touched it. It's a very short list. So I think that being creative with English and being very determined to investigate all of these things is so crucial. And being poetic. I don't generally do this, but I'm going to actually read a few paragraphs from an article that I published back in 2005 at UCLA and in the Indigenous Peoples Journal of Law, Culture, and Resistance. and it's called the sacred birthright of indigenous nations and peoples. Distinct and diverse, indigenous peoples are nations, born of the earth, the sacred life giver, placed by the Creator in sacred relationship with our respective homelands and territories throughout time. Our ancestors lived free and independent of Western colonialism and subjugation for an untold succession of ages until the empires of Christendom invaded our region of earth, which is commonly known in the foreigner's tongue as the Western Hemisphere. Our ancestors bequeathed to us the gift of a sacred birthright, which is our very being as naturally existing nations and peoples. This sacred birthright is comprised of our languages, cultures, lands, deserts, mountains, forests, and our relatives, such as the buffalo, caribou, salmon, cedar, sage, sweetgrass, and corn pollen, as well as our spiritual and ceremonial traditions, our songs and sacred and ceremonial places, our oral histories, and the burial places of our ancestors. Our sacred birthright includes our minds, our philosophies and sciences, our economic systems and agricultural practices. It includes our petroglyphs and artifacts, and our sacred birthright also includes the rivers, streams, natural springs, lakes, underground aquifers, seas, bays, inlets, oceans, and all bodies of water, the precious and sacred liquid that flows through the veins of Mother Earth and sustains all life, and without which life cannot continue. Our sacred birthright includes an inherent right to live in peace, free of domination, subjugation, colonization, hate, and war. In short, it is our sacred birthright to live the spiritual way of life bequeathed to us by our ancestors. Yet for more than 5 centuries in this hemisphere, dominating political systems from Western European Christendom have worked to maliciously destroy our sacred birthright while heedlessly disrupting the balance, harmony, and beauty of life in the process. Our sacred birthright, which we shall never freely forfeit, includes the right to heal from the trauma of colonization and to one day be free and independent of all forms and manner of colonial domination. We have a solemn responsibility to use every fiber and breath of our being to uphold and protect the sacred birthright of our own children and young people for the benefit of our future generations and for the benefit of all life. Every spark that spirals into the air from a ceremonial fire represents the spiritual energy of the universe that burns in each and every one of us. We have the ability to combine together the fire of our spiritual energy as human beings to become a tremendous force of healing, cultural resurgence, and revitalization. Words attributed to the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh express a credo for our sacred birthright. Live your life that the fear of death may never enter your heart. Love your life, perfect your life, and beautify all things in your life. Seek to make your life long and its purpose the service of your people. Prepare a noble death song for the day when you go over the great divide. Show respect to all people and grovel to none. When you arise in the morning, give thanks for the food and for the joy of living. If you see no reason for giving thanks, the fault lies only in yourself. Abuse no one and nothing, for abuse turns the wise ones into fools and robs the spirit of its vision. The powerful example of Tecumseh's life provides a lesson that says, never submit, never give in, never surrender your spirit to those who would capture it and hold you against your will under a system of domination. So these are the types of expressions that I've been making over the years, but I never know to what extent people actually notice them or see them or whatever. So I appreciate this occasion to read that, which I don't think I've ever done that publicly. And so my book is called Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. And we also have a documentary movie called The Doctrine of Discovery Unmasking the Domination Code that I made with my friend Sheldon Wolfchild, based on my years of research and additional research we did during that time. And we had the good fortune to interview Dr. Luis Rivera Pagan from Puerto Rico for the making of that movie. What an extraordinary man he is. And he published a book in 1992 called A Violent Evangelism, and he uses domination throughout the book. And we were having a hard time figuring out how to make the movie. And when I found that book, it was kind of funny. I said, Sheldon, we got to go to Puerto Rico. So he found the money, and we ended up being able to go there and interview him. And he's just an amazing addition to the movie. There's so much to be said in a presentation such as this. It kind of goes on forever. But one of the things that's important to know is that Justice Joseph Story, who was on the Supreme Court at the time of the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling, published a book called Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. He published that in 1833. And the opening of the book is regarding British titles or claim of title to the lands in North America. And he paraphrases the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling before actually quoting it at the outset of the book. And he cites to the Vatican Papal Bull of May 4th, 1493, and the Latin language that says, Ac barbarae nationes deprimantur, and barbarous nations be reduced. That word reduced is so critically important to pay attention to, because it doesn't just mean subjugation, but it means that their goal is to ultimately reduce us down to nothing. And they're very serious about it. And so it's, I think, important to deal with historical truth with accuracy as well as integrity. And that's where we get into the documentation of all these particulars. And this is an amazing little booklet called The Right of Discovery by Burke Aaron Hinsdale. I found this in the 1990s. It's funny because I ended up publicizing it so much that I think they, who knows if that had any influence on why they published it as a separate little publication like this. It initially appeared in the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Quarterly, and I had been working with Lakota people and others for quite a long time when I thought, I haven't really looked into our people and our history and the Ohio Valley and all that. So I began to do that, and that's how I found this book. The article in this publication, published in December of 1888, and it's called The Right of Discovery. And I think it's more aptly titled The Right of Domination, or The Claim of a Right of Domination. But it is very interesting how Hinsdale lays this out in just incredibly brilliant detail. And he makes a point here that I think is I want to end with this. He's talking about the acquisition, or excuse me, the maritime powers working to appropriate the new lands and countries and peoples to their own uses. And he wants to look at this more in depth. The first fact to strike the mind as we enter upon this investigation is that the appropriations were made and justified on a new principle. Mr. Wheaton, he's referring to Henry Wheaton in his Elements of International Law, published in 1836. And Wheaton, by the way, was the reporter for the Supreme Court at the time of the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling. Mr. Wheaton observes that nearly all the nations of Europe hold their European territory by a title which, quote, was originally derived from conquest. Just read that as domination, which has been subsequently confirmed by long possession and international compacts to which all the European states have successively become parts. The meaning of this is that titles which began in violence, read that as domination, have been confirmed and strengthened and in a sense purged, in other words, made good, by that form of presumption. That's an assumption, right? Presumption arising from lapse of time, which the text writers call prescription. And he defines that as the constant and approved practice of nations shows, says Mr. Wheaton, that the uninterrupted possession of territory or other property for a certain length of time by one state excludes the claims of every other in the same manner as by the law of nature and the municipal code of every civilized nation, a similar possession by an individual excludes the claim of every other person to the article of property in question. So in other words, that first in time, first in right type of principle. This rule, he proceeds, is founded upon the supposition, confirmed by constant experience, that every person will naturally seek to enjoy that which belongs to him. And the inference fairly to be drawn from his silence, this is the key, silence and neglect of the original defect of his title and his intention to relinquish it. In other words, if you don't speak back against the presumption of a right of domination and make that very clearly known, I do not consent to this claim of right of domination, then over time, it will seem as if it has just become a natural part of the fabric of the reality system that everyone is living. And one of the things that's extraordinary in here is he's referring to Francis Lieber, who also taught at Columbia University. And he was a brilliant political scientist who wrote about all these types of things and the history that I'm talking about. And he made the distinction between terra nullius, N-U-L-L-I-U-S, which would be a desert island where no one even lives at all, and there's no people there whatsoever, and terra nullus. And terra nullus is referring to a heathen, pagan, infidel, or unbaptized person. So a people that are labeled as the projection that is being put on them is that they're heathens, pagans, infidels, and therefore nullus and not existing. They don't count. They don't have to be acknowledged as even having an existence that can stop their claim of a right of domination. So these are some of the details and nuances and subtleties that my work has led me to, and I very much appreciate this time. And I'll stop a little bit before the top of the hour so that we can have some Q&A or comments if you care to engage. So, Wanishi, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Steve.